Welcome. If you've stumbled onto this, I hope you can find it useful. Ozymandias. Well, that's one I think I did way back in my own Matric year. I got a long history with this, yet I will try to keep it as short, as focused on the main points and issues that you would need. And also, there's a link. I'll put a link to a copy of the poem if you want to use it to print out a copy to annotate. I like to annotate, not so much because I actually refer to data, but because the annotating helps me remember some of the important points that I need. Let's get to it. This poem a lot of it is about legacy and power and how it fades. I want to just share a few images just to get you thinking about, maybe get something to stick about the overall meaning behind the poem. You might recognize this guy, you might not, no problem, but he was a hugely famous and influential figure. These pictures of ruins and empires just show how things decay over time. Again, very important here. And the question you might want to ask is how long until our own civilizations, our own achievements would end up fading? More modern one, more example, not in quite entirely a civilization, of course, but things that we think will last forever, such as the Twin Towers, tragically can disappear more quickly than we assumed that they would stay around for. And then you might want to even take this further. Items, prominent buildings, the Burj Khalifa, how, if you were to place bets on it, how long do you think something like this is going to last? 100 years from now? 200 years from now? 300? Will it still be standing? Yeah, I don't know if we can take it as far as putting Donald Trump in the position of someone like Ozymandias, but certainly he's someone who's known for focusing on his image, his reputation, his legacy, and has quite a lot of power and enjoys that power. How long will he be remembered for? Just think about it, talk about it, open up for discussion. The poem engages with very similar ideas. Okay, the poet, Percy Shelley, romantic poet with a capital R, focused on power. I think challenging to authority is a big sticking point in this poem. The revolution, change. Got this kind of baby manhood, baby boy kind of vibe going on here. I think for the time, with the unbuttoned collar and the waftly hair, just a pretty open, pretty radical depiction of someone. But he died young. He died at 29, and potentially there may be three things about him that you could learn. He was a pioneer of polyamory, as it's known today. Open love, free love. He mingled with many partners, even though he eventually got married to a famous writer who wrote Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. And then he was kicked out of Oxford for defending atheism. Man knows how to challenge beliefs and to not be swayed by others. Bold move. He died sailing a yacht, which he built and kitted out to sail way faster than it was meant to sail, in conditions that he was warned about, because it was known to be very stormy at that time of year, and that was the end. But actually, it was suited to his free spirit, to a sense of adventure, taking risk, being bold, pioneers of YOLO, if you want to put it that way, living life to the full, and that's how he went out. So, key thing to take away here. Anti-authoritarian position, perhaps, of the Romantics. He challenged power, and he supported revolution and change and just wild energy. Something to take away. Okay, so if you get this in the poem, you're going to succeed. The primary intention to deal with this fully, this poem aims to communicate the ephemeral nature of power. By ephemeral, we are meaning short-lasting, disappears, fades far quicker than we think it would. The ephemeral nature of power. And this also criticizes the arrogance or hubris of those people, and by extension, civilizations, who think that their legacy and power is eternal. Take that to heart, bear that in mind as you read through the poem or listen to the poem in the next section. And then there is a more subtle intention going on in this poem, which is worthwhile. I'll touch on it. I think it's more of an extra. Get the main idea, and we'll discuss a little bit about the power and skill of artists, which is also backed up in the poem. Okay, so Ozymandias was actually the historical figure, or is actually the historical figure. Ramses II. Ozymandias is his Greek name, and Shelley wrote about him because there was a statue being moved to a British museum, and he heard about the statue, and he wrote this sonnet. And it is a sonnet, bear that in mind, 14 lines. It has a bit of a blended structure though, so it's not quite a Petrarchan sonnet, and it's not quite a Shakespearean sonnet. It's a bit of a blend. It's got mixed rhyming schemes between the two, but I would say on the whole, you can treat it as a Petrarchan sonnet divided into 8 lines, as I've done on this page, the octet and then the sestet. Main standout feature here, and I hate making these abstract structural kind of comparisons, but it's Shelley, maybe challenging power, challenging form a little bit, blending forms. Maybe you could mention that in an answer. But I think the big standout is there's no rhyming couplet. There's no kind of definitive conclusion that you reach. It's a very uncertain, there's a sense of things being lost and forgotten at the end, and that for me moves it more firmly into the Petrarchan sonnet camp here. Okay, pause this. I'm going to attach a reading if you want to listen to a great reading, or just read it yourself. Bear in mind those 2 intentions that I argued for or put on the previous moment, and see if you can find that in the poem. Really take that time, because if you can read it and understand it, then the job's done, really. Okay, so hopefully you've got the general impression that this is about a guy who meets someone else who tells him a story about traveling to a desert, finding this what once was an impressive statue, but now it's in the middle of nowhere. It's all ruined and destroyed, and this trails on to get him thinking something about life and the person who made the statue, and Ozymandias, who was the statue. Okay, that's what's happening in the poem. But your main question is going to revolve around how is Ozymandias depicted here? And your key here is to refer to concepts such as tone and diction, your word choice. In fact, if you focus and are aware of how specific word choice, its connotations and its meaning create patterns in the poem, and that those patterns sometimes back up an attitude or an impression, I promise you in comprehension, in critical literacy, in your literature papers, your mark will go up by 5-10% as long as you just obsess about words and their meaning and show that you understand those meanings. So here we go. The key question is, what are we learning about Ozymandias here? 2 sets of words that I want to link here. You'll see the ones in the red. They're really focusing on connotations of Ozymandias which strike fear and power and even cruelty into those he perhaps once led. So a bit of a mixed tone here. I would say the speakers are probably just intrigued and curious and maybe disapproving of Ozymandias, but there's also the reaction of the people who lived with Ozymandias, who he ruled over, and their reaction, their attitude can be seen in the poem as suggested to be they're terrified of him, they're scared of this totalitarian dictator, this ruler. Okay, so look at the words, and to point them out, they're vast. He was big, he was powerful. Okay, he has this massive frown. The visage is his face, and it's fallen down, so again it's decayed next to his massive statue, and he's got this frown which shows that he was always a very serious, very maybe unhappy, commanding kind of guy. He's wrinkled, which kind of also suggests that he is perpetually commanding and unhappy, and this kind of very unpleasant sneer. So yeah, he's not the type of person out to make friends at all. And wonderful phrase to quote or use in an answer: cold command. Notice the alliteration, the hard sounds that are coming through there, showing how merciless he was, right? How cold and hard a person he was. And then I love those final lines on this section on the octet. The hand that mocked them. On the statue, he must have had this raised hand that really insulted those and commanded those that he ruled, right? In an unpleasant, unpleasant doesn't do it justice, in a very cruel and malicious way. And then the heart that fed. So Ozymandias' heart here, as a leader, was one that just fed from his people, right? That he was insatiable. He could not ask more. He kept on asking more from his people to give him things, to build, to keep the civilization going. So pretty cruel leader in that diction. On the other hand, you've got the intention coming through here and a kind of a different attitude forming, which leads to that fragmentation, that loss, that decay of power. So you've got in the blue, the trunkless. So his body, his trunk, is gone. It's fallen to the side. So it's again ruined, right? The power is no longer there. Words such as half sunk, again showing the ruin and shattered, and also lifeless. So the fact is the guy is long gone dead, and the lifelessness of the blocks, right, that his image is stamped on, that is all that remains. And so he has no more power in this world. Okay, and so we transition to the sestet, and the transition here really marks this coming really close to Ozymandias. We actually read his words as they are written on the pedestal, which is the base of the statue, the broken statue. And it's almost like he's alive for an instant. So there's this injection of perhaps fear or terror as this man speaks to us through the poem, right? But the key thing that you need to grasp in the sestet here is the irony. This is going to be the question that you get, or you can use to answer the more difficult questions in this poem. So getting to it a bit more closely, if you see here his actual words of what he speaks, what is Ozymandias' attitude towards himself here, really? Okay, in his words, we see that he sees himself as a great, almost all-powerful being. He introduces himself as Ozymandias, as if everyone knows who he is. He gives himself a title, right? Who gives themselves titles when they introduce themselves? King of Kings. He commands with that verb, look, to everyone who sees him. Look at my works. In other words, all that has been achieved, that I've built up around me in my civilization. And he even says here, ye mighty, those who are mighty and strong in the world, look at me and feel fear, feel like you are inferior, despair. Okay, so it shows him as being. It tells us so much actually about who he is, because what type of person would want this to be written about them, right? So that they are remembered for their terror, so that they are remembered for their power. Okay, so he is, to put it bluntly, a dickhead, right? But he's an absolute narcissist, someone who's just grasping after power. Okay, and that's how he wants to be remembered, for his ability to terrify others. Okay, so the irony is that that's what he expects about himself. That's how he thinks it will be for all time. And yet you contrast this to what comes next, right? Which is in the final 3 lines of the poem, we have nothing, and we have the diction like decay and colossal wreck and bare. And these are all adding to the meaning of, in actual fact, nothing of this has really lasted at all. There is destruction around him. Nothing of his works or his achievements actually remain. Okay, and then you've got kind of these oxymorons. It's quite a colossal wreck, right? There's this immense power, but it's actually just a wreck and destroyed. And we get this sense of loneliness, which comes into these last lines, right? Everything around is stretched out. There's nothing around him. It's bare. And so all of his achievements have come to being forgotten, come to being quite lonely. There's a sense of isolation and emptiness. Okay, and just to note that this is also borne out by the sound devices would be a big kind of point to mention here. At the end of the poem, you've got this caesura, that full stop in the middle of the line, in that line 10, 11, 12, okay, which really kind of pointedly slows down the rhythm at this moment, right? That sudden stop in the line, with lots of high, drawn out vowel sounds. Nothing, besides, remains, and then the ound and the bound, and also a bit of sibilance you could pick up there with these S sounds stretching on. So the rhythm slows down, and it gives a sense of this just unending, flat, bare landscape, which is boundless. You can just stare and stare into the distance, and it just emphasizes how much power he has lost, how much he has become forgotten, how much he is actually without any recognition anymore. Okay, and maybe the final thing to mention in this last bit here is just the speaker, right? So we're left with this kind of question and the tone of the speaker. What is the attitude of the speaker here, right? I think there's a bit of satisfaction that Ozymandias didn't get what he wanted, right? That his arrogance didn't come to fruition. He got his just desserts. Okay, there's a little bit of that creeping in there, but the loneliness in these final 3 lines is so immense, and it's there in the diction and in the sound devices and in those continuous enjambment lines, right? The enjambment starts to creep in. Essentially, especially as I would state it, is the question is kind of thrown out there. Okay, cool. Ozymandias didn't get all of his power, but if he didn't, and he was very powerful, what's the fate of me and what I'm achieving, right? What's the fate of all civilizations? And that's where a bit of the doubt kind of spreads out from the poem. Something to pay attention to. Okay, so if you're clicking with what has been said before, I reckon you're 90% of the way there. There's actually a tone of kind of admiration for one figure in the poem, and that is the sculptor. Notice how his ability to represent Ozymandias is celebrated, right? He could capture the anger, the ruthlessness of Ozymandias in the way that he sculpted his sneer and his snarl. And so there is this real deep appreciation of the power of the artist or the sculptor, who is the one who has really enabled Ozymandias to be remembered by the end of the poem. Okay, and this point of who controls Ozymandias' story, even though it has become very, very forgotten, is one that you can see in the narrative structure of the poem, right? Which is to make this connection that, this poem is trying to show how forgotten Ozymandias is, how he's no longer as relevant as he once thought he was. That's the irony, right? He thinks he will survive for eternity. No one will be more powerful than him. But this is contradicted by the setting, by how ruined everything is. And so when you get to the narrative structure, just kind of think for a moment about how many speakers there are in the poem, how the story gets to us. It's a very layered story. And this is the point that I really actually love about this poem in what Shelley did. It's very clever here. So we start with this character, this I, who's kind of telling us the story of the poem, who meets a traveler who tells him the story. Okay, and so we're hearing a story of a story, and then we get to the sculptor figure who, through his statue, is kind of also telling us something about Ozymandias in a different way. We get to the sestet in the poem, and we get to Ozymandias' actual words, and so we get to Ozymandias' account of himself within the story. So, in other words, before we get to Ozymandias' words, we have to wade through so many other stories. He's so distant, right? And that kind of narrative layering adds to how forgotten he is. He's buried within stories and stories and stories, almost forgotten as a rumor out there in the world, which matches up with the setting and the desert and being alone and barren and all of that kind of thing. But it's in the layering of the narrative itself. But the one final point you might want to take away from this, particularly because it's Shelley himself, is how Shelley does kind of celebrate, to a point, the artist kind of getting his revenge. He was once a sculptor working for Ozymandias, and he was powerless and he was commanded to do these things. But he actually, the way that he represented Ozymandias, the way that he showed his cruelty so accurately, that is what really sticks in history, and that is what is remembered. And Shelley himself, writing this poem, right? His crude interpretation of Ozymandias as this very, very cruel authoritarian figure, who I don't know the historical details as to whether that's true or not, but his story is one that we now associate with the name Ozymandias. This might not be how historians think of Ramses II, but when in the popular world, all of us today, the first thing many people click on when they hear Ozymandias is Percy Shelley's poem, is that lesson of how power decays, of how we shouldn't be arrogant or hubristic, right? And that it is, in a sense, in the long term, there's this question of how much do storytellers actually really allow legacies to be carried on? How much control and power the storytellers have over those who used to have power and over them, essentially. A question worth thinking about could crop up, you could find it useful. Okay, so a bit north of 15 minutes there, but I include that extra section as additional. So hopefully I snuck under. I'm just going to leave you with this sheet of what I think are really useful words to apply and use when answering questions to this poem. So, there's that idea of power being ephemeral, or I actually prefer the word fleeting. Nothing lasts for as long as we assume it would. For example, you can use really nice verbs in this poem, like undermine or subvert. So, the poem's intention might be to subvert, right? To challenge, to overthrow the power that Ozymandias thinks he's always going to have. Hubris and arrogance. Desolation is a really nice term to use to describe the loneliness and how broken Ozymandias's civilization became. And then just key concepts. I couldn't explain all of them directly and define their definitions, but you should go over these and just check yourself that you know how to apply these to the poem when you see it. I tried to cover most of those words. Just the irony is so crucial to this poem, and it is to so many poems, but especially the sestet in this poem. So you could easily answer a question there if you define irony as the contradiction of an expectation. It is my go-to quick definition. Use that in your answer. Say something like, the irony here is that Ozymandias expects he will be all-powerful and that people will fear him forever. However, this is contradicted by the barren setting, by his broken statue, and quote some diction there to illustrate your point, and then say which all of this shows that Ozymandias no longer has any of that power, etc. So that's how you tackle irony questions, and it's a really good formula to focus on using that definition in your answer. Excellent. Hope you can draw something from this, and hope it didn't enter into too much waffle. Thanks, guys. Cheerio.